Welcome to this strategic executive briefing. You are most likely here because your organization is either navigating a massive enterprise technology transformation or preparing to authorize the capital for one. The reality of deploying enterprise resource planning platforms and artificial intelligence at scale is unforgiving. We are not going to review software features or vendor marketing materials today. We are going to systematically analyze the data. We will move from a rigorous post-mortem of high-profile corporate failures to a concrete operational blueprint for human integration.
Our analysis is divided into 4 critical phases. We begin with a high-stakes executive overview. We then transition into a detailed operational post-mortem. Following that, we deconstruct the human blueprint. We will conclude with a strictly defined chronological action plan.
Part 1. The high-stakes executive overview.
75%. That is the baseline failure rate for enterprise resource planning projects according to Gartner. McKinsey corroborates this severity, noting that over 70% of all digital transformations fail to achieve their desired return on investment. The landscape for artificial intelligence is even more severe, with industry analysts estimating that nearly 80% of enterprise AI initiatives never reach production scale. If you are a chief operating officer signing a multi-million-dollar vendor agreement, the mathematical probability suggests you will erode organizational capital rather than create it. When these massive deployments fail, the damage is not contained to the IT department. They actively paralyze global supply chains and consistently destroy quarterly earnings.
This brings us to the core thesis of our briefing. Technology rarely fails. People, processes, and misaligned incentives do. The breakdown of enterprise platforms is almost never a fundamental coding issue or a failure of the software architecture itself. It is invariably a failure of executive governance, operational change management, and human integration. An algorithm does not reject a new corporate workflow. A senior analyst with 12 years of specialized domain expertise rejects a workflow that threatens their professional value. Automating broken processes without aligning the human operators involved merely scales up your existing organizational inefficiency.
Part 2. A detailed operational post-mortem.
We must examine how these structural failures manifest in reality. Consider Hershey Foods in 1999. They initiated a massive replacement of their legacy systems, selecting 3 entirely disparate platforms in SAP, Siebel, and Manugistics. The software architecture was complex, but the fatal error was the executive timeline. Leadership forced this highly complex integration into an impossible 30-month deployment window and made the catastrophic decision to launch precisely during their peak Halloween production season. They bypassed mandatory testing phases and fundamentally neglected user training. The structural result was a direct loss of $100 million in unprocessed orders, permanently ceded market share, and an immediate 8% drop in their stock price. It stands as a definitive case study of an impossibly rushed timeline, completely breaking the limits of human adaptation. Nike faced a remarkably similar operational disaster just 2 years later. They launched a $400 million supply chain modernization initiative focused heavily on demand planning via i2 technologies. The system was disconnected from their legacy architecture, which naturally generated severe data errors. But the deeper, more fatal issue was a profound lack of change management protocol. Massive internal resistance from employees led directly to workflow paralysis. The demand planning system failed to accurately forecast requirements for highly profitable items, resulting in thousands of unfulfilled Air Jordan orders. The total financial impact included a $100 million loss in direct revenue, millions in compliance fines, and ultimately required a staggering $500 million reinvestment simply to fix the resulting technical debt. Relying purely on vendor promises without actively managing the human transition leads to catastrophic capital losses. We also see failure scale at both extremes of the deployment spectrum. The German grocery chain Lidl spent 7 full years and over $580 million attempting to force a modern SAP inventory system to perfectly mimic their highly unique, outdated legacy record-keeping processes. This extreme over-customization made the new software so brittle and rigid that they eventually abandoned the entire $580 million project and reverted to their old systems. Conversely, examine National Grid. Pressured by internal delays and the external chaos of Superstorm Sandy, executives rushed an SAP launch. They skipped essential system testing phases and completely bypassed user validation. The immediate operational aftermath was millions in uncollected revenue, thousands of unprocessed vendor invoices, and employees receiving wildly inaccurate paychecks. They eventually reached a $75 million settlement with their vendor, which barely covered a fraction of their operational losses. Both extremes, over-customizing the software and skipping the testing, guarantee failure at scale.
The historical data dictates that before an organization touches complex AI or advanced workflow optimizations, leadership must secure what is defined as Phase A stability. First, you must rigorously cleanse and validate your legacy data. Transferring corrupted, outdated data into a modern, high-speed architecture simply guarantees terrible business output at a much faster rate. Second, you must normalize your core operational structures to ensure clean financial ledgers and perfectly valid inventory counts. Third, you must execute a strict minimum viable implementation. This means focusing exclusively on the fundamental engines of the business, such as procure-to-pay and order-to-cash. You must secure the baseline core integrity of the enterprise before you allow your teams to chase technological hype.
Part 3. The Human Blueprint.
The functional mechanics of any software platform are completely irrelevant if your workforce refuses to operate it. Executive leadership often mischaracterizes employee resistance to change as a toxic corporate culture. In reality, it is a highly rational psychological response to a perceived threat against their livelihood. Consider a senior analyst who has spent an entire decade mastering highly complex financial modeling. That specific expertise is their identity capital. When an intelligent system is deployed to automate that exact modeling process, the analyst does not merely see a shift in their daily workflow. They perceive a direct, existential threat to their professional relevance and their value to the firm. If your deployment strategy completely ignores this destruction of identity capital, your multi-million-dollar software will hit an impenetrable wall of human friction.
This dynamic perfectly illustrates why modern artificial intelligence rollouts are uniquely volatile. Traditional enterprise software is deterministic. It functions exactly like a calculator. You input specific numbers, and you receive the exact same result every single time. The human workforce is psychologically conditioned to trust deterministic systems. AI, however, is probabilistic. It functions more like a newly hired intern. The output actively shifts based on specific context, continuous retraining, and edge cases. AI does not simply automate a static process. It attempts to replicate and sometimes replace human judgment. It is entirely rational and highly expected for veteran employees to actively distrust a system that generates a different recommendation on Tuesday than it did on Monday.
The source material clearly identifies 5 fundamental forces that dictate the success or failure of a transformation. First is identity threat, the paralyzing fear of replaced expertise that we just examined. Second is the loss of autonomy. When intelligent systems prescribe actions to employees without explaining the underlying rationale, it generates severe algorithmic aversion. Third is latent inequality. Technological transformations often distribute operational benefits unevenly across departments, creating deep internal tension. Fourth is rational distrust. Trust in a probabilistic AI system is only built through consistent, localized, small wins, not through mandatory corporate training modules. And fifth, misaligned incentive structures. If a sales representative is financially measured strictly on daily call volume, but the new AI tool automates client outreach to reduce that volume, the legacy incentive structure actively punishes the employee for using the new technology.
We can analyze a precise case study of a financial services firm managing 2,800 employees. Leadership deployed a highly advanced intelligent assistant for their advisory teams, aggressively projecting a 30% gain in total productivity. 1 year post-launch, user adoption had stalled at a disastrous 20%. The failure was entirely based on human friction. Existing compliance regulations still required manual human review of every single automated draft, immediately erasing all theoretical time savings. Furthermore, the advisors were still incentivized and compensated purely by raw revenue generation, offering zero reward for learning a new system. Executive leadership executed a strategic pivot. They aggressively negotiated tiered compliance rules specifically for AI-generated content. They redesigned corporate scorecards to financially reward system adoption. Finally, they appointed their most senior advisors as the official internal mentors for the new technology, effectively restoring their threatened identity capital. 18 months later, sustained adoption hit 78%. They solved the human operational element and rescued a failing deployment.
Advanced change management is not a soft human resources function. It is mathematically the highest leveraged financial mechanism in your entire transformation portfolio. The data confirms that a poorly managed rollout typically captures only 20 to 35% of the platform's theoretical value. Conversely, a highly managed rollout that actively utilizes diagnostic testing and incentive realignment routinely captures between 60 and 80% of the projected value.
If the theoretical financial return of a new platform is $30 million over a 5-year timeline, the operational difference between a failed rollout and a successful one is $20 million in pure, unrealized corporate capital.
Part 4. The chronological action plan and strategic guardrails.
The analytical material is absolutely definitive on this point. Organizations that attempt to skip the strict 90-day diagnostic foundation, often hiding behind the guise of operational agility, almost universally end up losing 18 months of downstream progress to severe workflow paralysis. Flawless execution requires unyielding operational discipline. This 90-day diagnostic phase is the ultimate structural capacity test for your enterprise. Month 1 is entirely dedicated to mapping the human geography of your firm. Instead of relying on generic, outdated organizational charts, leadership must utilize structured network analysis and localized sentiment surveys. The primary objective is to identify the true, undocumented centers of operational influence. You must isolate the active blockers to clearly understand the rational operational basis of their resistance. Simultaneously, you must pinpoint the true champions. These are the individuals who command actual, verified peer respect on the floor, not simply those holding managerial titles. This process provides executives with a highly precise map dictating exactly where to allocate finite change management capital.
Month 2 requires the execution of an aggressive operating model stress test. You must force the planned technological workflows through the harsh reality of your current, deeply flawed business processes. This phase fundamentally addresses the operational mechanics of decision-making. If an intelligence system makes a probabilistic recommendation regarding a multi-million-dollar supply chain order, you must legally and operationally define who actually holds the authority to approve it. Explicitly mapping these decision rights and highly specific escalation paths is mandatory. If your foundational operating model remains completely static, the newly purchased technology simply becomes an incredibly expensive, isolated sidecar that the core business ignores.
By month 3, leadership must enforce a highly disciplined change roadmap. This goes far beyond sending an optimistic email blast to the company. It must be a binding, chronological sequence of behavioral interventions, each assigned to specifically named operational owners. Crucially, this requires fully secured deployment budgets and formal, written commitment from the top 50 executives in the enterprise. If the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Operating Officer are not perfectly and visibly aligned with the Chief Information Officer, the operational rollout will inevitably fracture across departmental lines. That uncompromising top-level accountability is the singular mechanism that prevents a downstream structural collapse.
Throughout the multi-year deployment life cycle, the data strongly supports executing very specific behavioral interventions. First, aggressively deploy peer-to-peer buddy systems. This highly specific structure effectively bypasses organizational identity threats because operational advice is delivered entirely without managerial judgment or formal performance tracking. Second, institutionalize public failure rituals modeled directly by senior leadership. Requiring highly visible senior executives to publicly and routinely share their own technical struggles with the new tools builds immense psychological safety across the lower ranks. Third, mandate strict quarterly workflow friction audits. The sole purpose of these audits is to locate exactly where the new software actively annoys or slows down the end users, and then deploy secured capital to fund immediate, highly visible fixes.
When reporting the status of the transformation back to the board of directors, leadership must immediately abandon all vanity metrics. Tracking the raw number of employees who simply logged into the new system is irrelevant. Instead, executives must strictly measure adoption depth, which is defined as the precise percentage of eligible, highly complex workflows that are actually being completed end-to-end within the new platform. You must track the time to first value, calculating exactly how many days it takes for a newly trained user to hit a verified productivity outcome. You must measure the voluntary advocacy rate to mathematically determine who is actually recommending the platform to their internal peers. And ultimately, you must track the net value realized. This is the hard dollar financial benefit formally captured by the firm, minus the total operational cost of the implementation.
We conclude this executive briefing with the definitive question that every single leader must answer before authorizing their next massive technology purchase. The underlying technology is highly available, and the core algorithms function precisely as designed. The catastrophic failure points reside almost entirely within the boundaries of human governance and operational change management. Therefore, the singular, uncompromising question remains: is your organization structurally capable of absorbing the operational change your technology roadmap demands? If you cannot answer that question with exhaustive, data-driven certainty, your enterprise is not structurally ready to deploy. Thank you for attending the Strategic Explainer.